This week, we're going to analyze some of my interview with Dr. Ryan Mullins that I live streamed recently. For those of you who saw the interview live and wondered why I didn't push back harder on his views, it's because while that does make for a more entertaining interview, it's not conducive to getting more theist guests on the show, which is something that I would like to do. I think this format is better. Let the guest on the stream express their view. I will push back hard if they attack any group of people, but if they're just expressing their beliefs, I think we need to listen if we want to have any kind of meaningful conversation. Dr. Mullins had some valid points. He also has a faith that is far more flexible than mine was. Had I had such a faith, it would not have shattered so easily. Does that mean that there's a possibility of me returning to the fold? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome, especially to my patrons and channel members. Here's a new channel member that I have failed to acknowledge yet because of all the disruption in my channel due to the issues with my foot. But thank you so much for your patience. My guest a few weeks ago was a rare treat, Dr. Ryan Mullins. He's a professor of philosophy. He's written a number of books and papers on philosophy and theology, and he has a podcast called The Reluctant Theologian. I had several takeaways from this interview. First, I saw how some theists and I have been talking past each other, as we had differing definitions of what each of us took as self-defining terms. Second, I see now why my faith shattered so easily, and why that is such an appropriate metaphor for what happened. Finally, we will look at the rationale of Dr. Mullins' God beliefs, why he holds to these beliefs, and whether or not I found his position persuasive. And what are your arguments in favor of Calvinism?
Well, the arguments in favor of Calvinism usually boil down to something like this. So when you're trying to figure out what kind of world God would create, one kind of issue that comes up is, well, why would God have a world with evil and suffering in it? You got lots of different answers to it. And a lot of those answers depend on, is God going to be successful at overcoming evil? Because if God creates a world, he's got good reasons for creating a world where evil is possible, but he just can't defeat it. That's going to be a royal failure. Do you really want a God like that? Calvinism's no, of course not. You don't want a God like that. You want a God who's really in control, and you want a God who's definitely going to get the job done.
Dr. Mullins talks about what kind of God do people want. The Calvinist wants a God that is in control, and he can get the job done, whatever the job may be. I asked Dr. Mullins much later in the interview if there really is such a God. If God is a real person, what is true about that God should be a matter of fact, not a matter of what God we want. I didn't put it like this, as I'm not very good at coming up with well-articulated questions on the spot. It's much easier to reword them in a script like this. But to his credit, Dr. Mullins got the gist of what I was asking, despite my lack of precision in phrasing. But I think Dr. Mullins' phrasing here is careful and deliberate. He can correct me if I'm wrong on that point. Not just Calvinists, but all theists have the God that they want, despite the protestations. By this, I mean that some believers complain about cafeteria Christians that pick and choose the parts they like about God and the Bible and ignore or even call the parts they don't like heresy. Despite the claims of some preachers that they hold to the whole Bible, none of them really do. They still preach on verses that they don't like, and they'll still claim that every word of it is true, but they find a way to reinterpret the parts that don't fit with their morality, like the claims that biblical slavery is just indentured servitude, or the parts that don't fit with reality, like the creation story. We continue to poke fun at how out of touch with reality the young earthers are, those that hold to a rigid view of biblical creation. But even the softer views, that God guided an evolutionary process, still leaves you with a faith that doesn't work with parts of the Bible. Here's what I mean. If God guided the evolution of man, then man is not a special creation of God. Adam and Eve become figurative, not literal people. Some do hold to this view. Others say that God created Adam and Eve alongside of the evolved humans. Both these views create serious problems for Jesus being a real person. First, the genealogy of Jesus traces back to Adam. The Bible lists specific people that are in the line of Jesus. If Adam, the first in line, wasn't a real person, were any of them real? How can any real human trace his lineage to a figurative person? If you hold that Adam and Eve were real people created alongside of other humans, then how can they be the purveyors of original sin? Were all the humans that came before Adam and Eve sinless? If through Adam all sinned, what about all the other people that lived before Adam or alongside Adam? They could not have inherited original sin from Adam, as they are not his progeny. Dr. Swamidass is the premier promoter of this theory. Some respond by saying those lines all died out, so all of current humanity are descendants of Adam and Eve, which answers the question as to modern humans, but not as to ancient humans. Did those humans that lived before Adam have sin in their lives? If not, Jesus was not the only sinless person. If so, then sin didn't enter the world through Adam. Each of these views does exactly what Dr. Mullins is talking about here. They each seek to reconcile their own views on God with what we observe in the natural world, resulting in each being able to hold to the God of their choice. Except for Ken Ham, who goes the other direction of denying what we see in the natural world in order to hold to the God views of his choice. We atheists often tell Christians that we don't choose our beliefs. We believe what we are convinced of. But maybe the believers have a point here as well. They do choose their beliefs, as they don't believe in a God that they are convinced is real. Rather, they choose their beliefs based on the God that they want to be real. This would explain why so few can articulate why they believe what they believe. They just do. They want this God. They want this to be true, so they believe it.
And that should give you some peace. That should give you some comfort. At least that's the way the Stoics talk. And a lot of different Christians over the years talk, is like there's a sort of peace and comfort that comes in knowing that whatever the way the world goes, God's definitely going to succeed in fulfilling whatever his ultimate purpose is. So that's one.
And there is the reason for believing it. It makes them feel good. Not that it's true. It just feels good.
When I'm looking at a view that I'm calling Calvinism, what I really mean is something called theological determinism, which is a particular story about how God knows the world, and it involves some kind of story about election and predestination. So what you're pointing out is this area. You're saying, if you're really going to say that God elects or predestines certain people to salvation, you really can't say he just kind of allows people to go to hell or something. It seems like he's really electing them to as well. This is what's called double predestination. I think that's the most consistent view. Like when I look at different consistent statements from theological determinists, I do not know how you can possibly avoid having double predestination. So I think the more intellectually honest view would just be bite the bullet and say, yep, God elects both. What do you want? I can explain how they try to get out of it if you want to do that.
I've heard a number of people explain their way out of it, and usually it is exactly as you say, and I'm glad you gave me a new word, double predestination. I've never heard that term before, but you're absolutely right. Most people I talk to will make the argument that no, God only predestines the elect. The unelect were not predestined. And I'm always flabbergasted that anyone can think that way, because if you've got 5 apples and say, I choose these, how can you say, well, you didn't not choose the others?
Yeah, it seems like there's some kind of choice going on here. So I'm thinking the earliest case where you see this distinction that I'm about to make that gets really kind of clear is with Peter Lombard, who is in the 1100s. And so he predates Calvin by a lot, but it's very influential for all subsequent theologians. And so he makes this very clear distinction between God foreknowing and God electing. So he'll say God elects and predestine the redeemed, and he merely foreknows the damned. So he's not actively damning them. He just foreknows that they're going to be damned. And so that's supposed to be the distinction. It's like God's actively doing something and electing these people, but he's just merely foreknowing that a bunch of others, they're not gonna go to heaven.
So I learned a new term, double predestination, and Dr. Mullins is right, at least as to most of the Calvinists that I have engaged with, that they don't hold to this. Using my apple example, God chooses 3 out of 10 apples as the ones that he wants, knowing the other apples are there and will be destroyed if he doesn't choose them, but chooses not to choose them anyway. It's not that God determines that the unchosen will go to hell. He simply ignores their plight, which again does not get you to the God that most people want, the loving, forgiving, benevolent God that sacrifices himself for his loved ones. Yes, he did that for the 3 chosen, but not for the 7 who were not chosen. This is the Calvinist position that I was taught. It intends to fix the problem of God's grace and mercy being ineffective to unbelievers, as so many don't get that grace and mercy. The Calvinist fixes the ineffective God failing to save those he desired to save by claiming that he never wanted to save them in the first place. God only intends to save the elect, the chosen ones. But in fixing the problem of God's grace failing for the unbeliever, they create a new problem. Their God never cared about the unbeliever in the first place. Their God, either through double predestination, chose the unbeliever for hell, or through foreknowledge, ignored their plight and offered them no mercy or grace. This seems to contradict the claims of God being just, loving, and impartial. The Calvinist will claim this is just, as whatever God does is just by definition. Their God is incapable of injustice, as he can, and in fact does, commit the most horrific acts. But if he does it, it's just fine, because he's God. Okay, but I ask, why would you want to worship this God? You know something is unjust or unloving, but you must claim that it is okay because your God does it. How do you live with the cognitive dissonance? And why would you want to? If you must accept that this God is real, why not ignore it as the villain that you know it to be? Mullins, of course, is not a Calvinist himself, thus I wouldn't expect him to defend this point. He acknowledges that there are problems with the Calvinist position.
Why would God create anything at all? Well, you might say for his own glory or his own goodness. Because
That's
it
the
can't
one that I'm
be,
used to hearing.
yes, because Calvinists like, I love God's glory. You know, it's so great. Supposedly. I don't know. Because I don't know what it means to say God's glory. But we say these kind of things a lot. So there's this French Calvinist named Moses Amarat. And so he's like the generation kind of after Calvin and some of these others. And he goes, that's not really a good reason for why God would create anything, because God already has all the glory. So God creates in order to get the glory he already had. It doesn't seem like a good reason to create. And you can do the same thing for other theological systems. So Thomism, so after Thomas Aquinas, which deeply influences a lot of different Calvinist thinkers later on, they'll say God creates for his own goodness. All of God's actions for his own goodness. And they're like, well, but God necessarily has all goodness on your view. So he's creating to get something that he already has? Like that, this doesn't make any sense. Like it doesn't seem like there's any reason why God would create it all. So I think if what a Calvinist should do to get out of this kind of problem is they need to change the story a bit. They need to get rid of certain claims.
This was an interesting take. Indeed, why would a perfect God who is complete in himself create anything? Especially when he knows that doing so will cause pain and suffering for the created. If for himself, for his own glory, as the Calvinist claims, then God is not loving by his own definition. If you say that the Bible is God's word, it would be extremely selfish to create evil, pain, and suffering for your own personal satisfaction, especially when you had no need of such satisfaction. I did ask about the apparent selfishness of God to my pastor when I was a believer. The response I got was, he's God. He is all that matters, which fed into my self-denial. The Bible encourages self-denial, which is part of why I tried to convince myself that I was not a person. After all, people have needs and desires. If only God's desires matter and mine do not, then I must not be a person. Try living with that cognitive dissonance. It nearly drove me crazy. Or maybe it did. What are your personal views?
About which topic?
About God, what theology do you hold to, if any?
So I want to say the basic concept of God is a perfect being who's the single ultimate foundation of reality. And so that's like a baseline kind of claim from there, you get all these interesting debates about, well, what are the things that make God perfect? What kind of attributes explain why God's perfect? And then what are the sort of things you need to say that explain why God's the foundation of reality? And so I affirm this view that's called neoclassical theism, where you say that God's got a set of certain attributes, like he's eternal, he's always existed. He is all powerful, all knowing, perfectly rational, perfectly good. And then I reject a bunch of very certain claims that classical theists want to make. They want to say God's timeless. I go, that's incoherent. You can't possibly make sense of that. They want to say God's unchanging, like full stop. Any way God could possibly change, he cannot change in any way, shape, or form. And I want to go, then you can't have God performing actions or knowing what's going on in the world. So that makes no sense. They want to say God's simple. That's a really weird topic. I've got a lot I've written on that, just saying this is not possibly true. And then they want to say God's impassible, which means that God cannot suffer and that God only has emotions that are consistent with his perfect happiness. And I want to go, ooh, you think God was happy during the Holocaust? That seems morally gross. We should get rid of that. So I want to get rid of a bunch of different claims that certain
That would
classical theists
also
affirm.
negate sin. I mean, the whole idea of sin is supposed to be it's a defense against God. So if God can't be harmed, then there cannot be any such thing as sin.
Yeah, so something that's relevant to this conversation. So in my second book, God and Emotion, I've got a whole chapter on divine wrath. And so what's weird is you've got all these classical theists saying God's got wrath, but it's only metaphorical because he can't really be upset because he can't be influenced by you in any way, shape, or form. And then I get all these quotes from these Calvinists going, if you deny God's wrath, then that just shows how evil and wicked you are. You're a horrible person if you deny God's wrath because you're denying the very goodness of God. A good person, And so like all these really like nice fiery kind of rhetoric. And so like, okay, so you want to deny that God's got wrath. All right. It seems like you're going to have these kind of problems here because it's the intuition is if God really is morally perfect, then he's going to get upset sometimes. Like he's going to get a little bit upset when bad things happen. And like you said, it seems like sin is supposed to be this offense against God, but if God can't possibly be offended, then I don't know why is God bad? Like this doesn't make any sense. Yeah. So that's
This is another point that I hadn't considered. Can the idea of God being complete in himself be compatible with the idea that he can be offended? If God is in fact complete, then nothing we do affects him. He remains complete, regardless of human action. I'm skipping the entire section on predestination and the philosophy of time. This opened to me some new areas of thought. I have a live stream scheduled on the philosophy of time coming up on January 10th to discuss this topic further. So in Calvinism, petitioning the Lord with prayer is even less useful.
It depends what you think the use is. So petitionary prayer, I think, is a good case in point, and this is a point of contention in a lot of debates, because if you're trying to change God's mind, can you really change God's mind, the Calvinist God's mind? Some Calvinists are going to go, well, no, you can't. So petitionary prayer, what you should really do is when you're praying is just trying to further align your will with God. That's the value of prayer. But not everybody likes that. So some others will go, well, the God of Calvinism, he ordains the means and the ends. So God wants certain things to come about, but he also wants you to ask for them because that's part of how you develop a relationship with someone. You talk to them. So they'll say, yeah, okay, it's true in a sense that God's not really responding to you because he figured out ahead of time what he was going to do. But part of that story of what he figured out ahead of time is he wants you to ask. So there's still some kind of value. There's a way of talking where it sounds like you have value.
One of the things that we talked about when I was a Calvinist as to the value of prayer was to support one another. Because we shared prayer requests with one another, we shared our burdens, and it was kind of a way of getting us to open up with one another.
Yeah. So yeah, prayer in general, but as I was thinking in terms of the question about petitionary prayers, where you're specifically asking God.
Yes. Yes.
But yeah,
right.
what you're talking about are important values because sometimes when we're doing petitionary prayer, we are doing it in public with a group of people, and the value there is the relational value of within the community. So yeah, there's certain kind of values I think the Calvinists can easily say that they get from petitionary prayer.
From a Calvinist perspective, then, God does not answer prayer. What are your views on inerrancy?
Inerrancy is another one of these terms like sovereignty where
Mhm.
it's hard to figure out exactly what the definition is.
Mm.
So I'm assuming the definition you're working with is there's this one definition that we use in America a lot that only goes back to the 1970s from this
Oh,
Chicago
really?
Statement of Faith. Yeah. Which is like super weird because so the Chicago Statement of Faith in the 1970s, I'm forgetting a lot of the details. So people look up the Wikipedia entry on the Chicago Statement of Faith. So they give this kind of story about inerrancy, and they'll say it's inerrant in all that it teaches. The Bible is inerrant in all it teaches, meaning contains no errors. Uh, and but then you'll see these kind of qualifications about well, it's only inerrant in the original manuscripts. Well, none of us have access to the original manuscripts,
Right.
so you're like, cool, the Bible's inerrant, but not the Bible that I have. Okay, so you could believe in inerrancy, and so what I could say to you is I could go, Kelly, your shattered faith over inerrancy, it's misplaced. You didn't read the original manuscripts. This Bible translation you've got, you're reading your New English Standard or whatever, I don't know which version you're using. That's not the inerrant one. Like it's supposed to only be in the original manuscripts. So no big deal, no big deal. The Chicago Statement of Faith, though, I think it gets a bit weirder. So they have a whole bunch of articles about how to interpret Scripture. Because of what you see when you look at a lot of different statements on inerrancy. There's a book called Inerrancy 5 Views. And Michael Bird has a really great chapter in there where he starts out his chapter going, just in the English speaking world, here's like 40 different definitions of inerrancy you're floating around.
Mm.
And you're like, oh, okay. And he's Australian. So he's like, here's a bunch of them in Australia and stuff too. And so all the Americans are going, something exists outside of America? No, I'm sorry. That's not the way things work. What you have in the Chicago Statement of Faith is it's not simply that it's inerrant, it's also forcing you to interpret the Bible a particular way. Not every inerrancy statement does that. So the Chicago Statement of Faith pushes you to where you have to interpret it as a young Earth creationist sort of story.
Okay.
Uh,
Mhm.
and not a lot of biblical scholars are going to be happy with that because they're going to go, I'm sorry, but that's not, we don't think that's what's going on in the text. We don't think you can really justify that interpretation. Well, you're denying inerrancy now, aren't you? And you're like, well, no. And so inerrancy is, I think, a very fuzzy term. A lot of definitions of it I can easily get like sign off on because they're so vague and fuzzy. But some versions of it, I'm like, that's just not plausible. So the one that we standardly hear in America, I think, is not very plausible. But other versions of it, it doesn't contain any errors with regards to matters of salvation. Okay, maybe there's something there. I don't know.
Here is where I find it hard to find any basis for believing in Christianity. If the Bible isn't inerrant, it contains errors, as Dr. Mullins says here. How does one go about deciding which parts are true and which parts are error? If there is a perfect God, why would the only revelation of him that we have today be flawed? How can a flawed work by people be a representation of a perfect God? One could make the argument that flawed people are a reflection of God himself, as the Bible says that we are in the image of God. Reflections or images are not intended to be fully accurate representations. As the Bible itself says, we now see through a glass dimly, but then we'll see face to face. Which makes me question two major points of doctrine. First, how can one claim to have a relationship with a person that you have only seen a poor reflection of? How can you claim to know this person or have insight into how this person thinks or feels about things? How can you be sure of anything you think or know about this person? Second, how can this person expect anyone commit to him, her, it, them, when the information we have about this person is flawed? Maybe we are clinging to an aspect that is inaccurate. If this God values truth, why would this God not reveal itself in truth, rather than in a flawed book? I can hear some apologists responding that our finite minds are incapable of comprehending all of God. Maybe so. But if there is a God, should that God not be able to communicate in an accurate way so that the parts of it that we can understand are not mired in flawed ideas? Do you hold to inerrancy? And for you, what does that mean?
I could say inerrancy in terms of everything you need to know for salvation. It doesn't contain any
Okay.
errors with regards to salvation. That seems to be when you look throughout church history and when you look at like Michael Bird's list of like 40 different definitions of inerrancy, that seems to be a common underlying theme. That leaves open, and which is what a lot of theologians want, is to leave open the interpretation for exactly what do you need to have salvation. Because there's a lot of different theories of atonement and what you need to have in order for salvation to take place, and that's a whole another topic. But yeah, something like that kind of definition of inerrancy, I can easily sign off on.
Let's go ahead and go that direction. If there is a God that wants us to do certain things in order to please him so that he'll let us into his heaven, the Catholics say that it's faith plus works. The Calvinists say it's whoever got chosen. Yeah, the Church of Christ people say it's faith in God plus you must be a member of our particular church. There's all these different requirements depending on who you listen to.
Mm-hmm. So the sort of story that I'm telling in order to also figure out exactly what I think about this is I'm trying to be as bare bones as possible, and then you can add on whatever theological bells and whistles you want from there. So I think one of the reasons why God would create a universe at all is to enter into friendship with as many humans as possible. And so God's going to need to create a kind of universe where friendship is possible. So it needs to be a universe, in my view, where there's uniform laws of nature that provide stable grounds for creatures to be able to develop with their own autonomy, their own freedom, and because those are some of the conditions you need in order to enter into genuine friendship with anybody, and also God. Now, the standards for how you start that friendship and then what the friendship eventually evolves into, those are different issues. So the standards for how that relationship starts, how that friendship starts, as a good person, like a good, like vaguely Protestant theologian, I would say it's through God's offer. It's His grace. He's the one who initiates it. It's not because of something I've done. It's something that God has done. He's the one who's like, hey, I want to be in friends with you guys. And then, yes, friendship is magic. It's just this journey along the way. That's what friendships is. So from there, though, how friendships evolve. Now that's where different theories of atonement and salvation and sanctification and all these other buzzwords, that's where things get tricky and complicated. And I don't know. I want to say something like this. I want to be friends with lots of people. I do not want to be friends with garbage people that I cannot trust, because no one wants to be friends with garbage people that you can't trust. And God's the same, because God's just like me, obviously. So He wants to be friends with, so He wants to be, He wants to be friends with people who can actually develop into righteousness.
I think this is far truer than even what Dr. Mullins would like to admit. Everyone's God wants what that person wants God to want. The reason that we have so many different ideas about what God requires for salvation is there are so many different ideas about who God is. Ultimately, we know nothing about any real person that could be called a God. We only know people's ideas about their gods. This is why I confidently say there is no God, even though I can never prove such a statement. If there is a God, I know nothing about this God. As I said to Dr. Mullins earlier, if there really is a personality God, then what this God thinks, does, feels, etc., will all be questions of fact, not faith. That no one knows for sure what this God thinks, feels, wants, etc., leads me to conclude that either this God is hiding, He won't reveal Himself, or He doesn't exist. If this God is hiding and does not want to be seen or experienced, then, at least in my experience, as well as that of all other human experience, there is no God. What do you think that God thinks about atheists?
I think it'd still be the case that God loves atheists. I don't see why He wouldn't.
Okay.
Because I think, so Calvinists like to talk a big game about grace.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I don't think they really do see God as that gracious,
Right.
because I want to think that when I look at the world in the way that it is, if God really does have good reasons for allowing the world to be the kind of world where it could have evil and suffering in it, then you're going to expect that certain people are not going to be super happy with you for a while. And I want to go, yeah, God knew that was going to happen. He even if he doesn't know the future, he could still easily predict. Like, so even if you want to be an open theist, God's easily going to predict some people are not going to be happy along the way. And so God's going to be gracious enough. He's a big enough guy. He can take that. So he's going to be like, yeah, I get it. I totally get it. But hang on. It's okay. I've got patience for you. I'll wait as long as it takes.
Cool. So Mullins God is okay with atheists, as they should be expected in the kind of world that we have. When it comes to any matter of opinion, and by opinion I mean anything that can't be proven one way or the other, one would expect a diversity of ideas. I think Dr. Mullins is right. If a God made this world and doesn't show himself to it, he should expect some not to think he's real. If this God wants a different result, all to know that he's real, providing this experience is well within his power. And by the way, I'm now using male pronouns for brevity's sake. The claim that if God reveals himself, it takes away your free will is invalid. Does a teacher take away your free will to choose to believe in creationism by teaching evolution? Laying out the facts is exactly what does give you free will. To demand, on pain of death, that people either believe in you, then not telling them that that is your demand, in no way gives a person a free will choice with regards to belief. Imagine going to your doctor who says you need surgery. She wants you to sign a consent form for the surgery. You ask what surgery she wants to do and why. What benefits will this surgery have? And she says, just have faith in me. You could do this, but it's foolish. Maybe she made a mistake. Maybe she misunderstood the symptoms you reported. Maybe she misheard you. Who knows? The only free will consent is informed consent. If there is a God that wants me to follow him, to see him for who he is, he needs to reveal himself to me so that I can make such a choice. The fact that no such God has done this, to me, is clear evidence that either this God doesn't care what I think, or this God doesn't exist. There's one more point that I wanted from this interview. One thing that I have come to believe as a result of conversations with people of many different views is that God beliefs are simply people's ideas about God, that lots of different people have different ideas about God, and that all of them originate within ourselves. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's right, but I don't think that's a problem because that is how we just do any sort of theoretical reasoning and speculation about the world as a whole. So we start with our intuitions, and then from there we try to develop some kind of methods and checks and balances for developing a coherent theory of things. So with God, yeah, it's definitely right. So a lot of cognitive scientists will say humans naturally develop beliefs about God by really early age. We're talking like between 3 and 7 years old. So like it's really quite young that we start doing this. And Calvin himself is like, yeah, that's exactly how it is. So he says, yeah, you can't know anything about God without knowing yourself, and you can't know anything about yourself without knowing God. So he's like, it goes back and forth. So what the cognitive science of religion is saying today, Calvin's like, I said that, several centuries ago. You're not telling me anything new. From there, things get interesting because people are developing their own theories about the nature of God, but what they're doing is implicitly doing different kinds of methods for thinking about God. And so what philosophers like myself will do is we'll try to identify these different methods for thinking about God. So one is what's called perfect being theology. So you think about what exactly does it mean to be perfect? Another one is called creator theology. So what would it take to be the creator of the universe? And so these are different kind of methodologies that I think a lot of people are doing to some extent. They're not doing it super well, but there's ways you can refine the methods and then develop philosophical arguments, very rigorous philosophical arguments for developing the ideas and testing them.
So who God is depends on the person thinking about God, as God ideas develop within ourselves. How is this any different than saying that God is not a real person? How can who a person is, God, vary with who is thinking about the God? Yes, different people can know different aspects of a person or different sides to a person, but those traits cannot be dependent on the person who is doing the thinking. If God is real, his traits must be real also. They can't be dependent on the person who is thinking about them. If they are, then God is not real. God is just an idea, not a person. What is the reason that you think that your God beliefs are true?
Because I'm Ryan Mullins. That's why. Yeah. I don't. There's no other possible answer. I mean, no, like the main reason is because I'm sitting down and really trying to look through all of the different views in as thorough detail as I can. Some people get annoyed because they want me to make decisions on certain views, and I'm like, I've not investigated enough. Um, so in 20 years from now, hopefully I'll have a nice textbook that summarizes all these things so that you could just be like, okay, here's the arguments for and against each one in a nice summarized detail. But that's the main reason why I think I'm absolutely right, and everyone is just a damned heretic who disagrees with me, is because I've thought through it better than everyone else has. Yeah.
Okay, very good. This is the clincher for me. Dr. Mullins believes he knows God because he has thought about God and has thought through who God is based on what other people think and say about God and his own research into the matter. He has no external reason, no evidence for this God, no reason to think this God is real. It's just intuition and thoughts. So while Dr. Mullins' religious beliefs are more palatable and more reasonable than the rigid, illogical belief system that I came from, it still has no factual basis for belief. I still contend that if there is a personal God, then there needs to be a factual basis, not an intuitive basis, to believe this. Human intuition has been terribly wrong before. Geocentrism is intuitive, but it's wrong. Flat Earth is intuitive, but it's wrong. I think we have reached the point in human history where we don't need gods to explain the unexplainable. We can accept that we don't have all of the answers yet, and maybe we never will. I'm not saying that Dr. Mullins' view of God is a God in the gaps view. It isn't. He isn't using God to fill in areas that he doesn't understand. But I do think that he worships a God of his own making, as his God is what he wants his God to be. And if he made this God by deciding what qualities he would want a God to have, then his God isn't real. It certainly isn't a person. I don't think we need a God to fill in gaps of knowledge or comfort us when we are down. Nor do we need a God to tell us what is good or moral, as we don't have such a God. If such a God exists, this God really doesn't care what we think about him or anything else, according to Dr. Mullins. If this God doesn't care about us, why should we care about him? I don't see much difference between an absent God, unconcerned about humans, and no God at all. So am I ready to return to the fold, make up a God I want and believe in that God? No, I'll stick with atheism. To me, it is more intuitive than God beliefs, based on the evidence that I have before me. Live your life. What is the reason that you think that your God beliefs are true?
Because I'm Ryan Mullins. That's why.